The title of this lecture is The Changing Life of the People in the High Middle Ages. First of all, let's begin with a review of the term feudalism. The focus of this chapter is feudalism, which we defined in a previous lecture as a political and social organization in which a powerful lord offers land, which is called a fief or a benefice in medieval times, and protection in exchange for military service from those who fight, or agricultural service from those who work, and loyalty. So a powerful lord offers land and protection in exchange for service and loyalty. The kind of service that the lord will receive for the grant of land depends on the person to whom he granted the land. If he gave a piece of land to a noble, that noble would then be pledged to give loyalty and military service to that lord. If the lord granted land to a serf, the serf would be pledged to be loyal and also provide agricultural service, or another way to put it simply is he, the serf, would be required to work along with his family on the lord's land. In reality, feudalism was not quite so simple as a king granting land to lords, lords passing on some of that land to serfs. Instead, we have more complicated levels called sub-infeudation. Sub-infeudation is feudalism with layers or degrees of wealth and power which separate each level. For example, rather than having just one solid group of lords, there were differing levels of lords based on how much land, power, and influence the lord has, so that the lords would be divided into great lords, lesser lords, and simple knights. Serfs, or those who work, also included in this category some individuals called slaves who were non-Christian individuals. Just to repeat here, feudalism or sub-infeudation is a political and social organization in which a powerful lord offers land called a fief or a benefice and protection. So this act of giving or granting land, or a fief or a benefice, is called investiture. The service and loyalty that that lord receives in return for investiture is called homage. So in exchange for the land and protection, a great lord, lesser lord, simple knight will offer military service. So if a king, for example, grants land to a great lord, the great lord then acts as a knight in the king's army. If a great lord subdivides his land and gives it to a lesser lord, that lesser lord then serves the great lord in the great lord's army, and so on and so forth. Just to remind you of the word vassal. A vassal means servant to the king. Everyone in the feudal system is a servant to the king. Everyone was a vassal. It has often been said of the life of the people in the High Middle Ages that all people could be divided into three categories. Those who work, that would be the serfs and the slaves. Their responsibility in the feudal system for society is to work the land and feed the people of all of Europe. The other group, those who fight. That would be the individuals like great lords, lesser lords, and knights who are pledged to protect all of society. And the third group is those who pray. Monks, nuns, priests, bishops, archbishops, and all the way up to Pope. The job of these individuals for society is to pray. Let's start with those who work, who made up more than 90% of the population. Those who work would be serfs and slaves, and even though they made up the majority of the population, very little is known about them because they were considered to be inferior to the other two groups. And since most of the serfs were illiterate, we have very little records which survive to tell us about their lives. So what we do know, which has been gained from other sources, is what I'm about to share with you. We know that the living and working conditions of those who work varied from place to place and depended upon the climate, soil type, and personality of the Lord for whom the serf worked. So a serf's quality of life depended on the climate in which he lived and had to farm. It also depended on the soil and the personality of the Lord. This just makes good sense. If you have a great climate with plenty of rain and a Lord who pretty much leaves you alone, your life would be better than someone who had a Lord who was mean and liked to terrorize the serfs that lived on his manor, or if you lived in a place where you had very rocky or sandy soil. The distinction between a serf and a slave is basically this. Neither a serf or a slave were free, but a serf could not be bought or sold like a piece of property. Serfs made up the majority of those who worked. Slaves were extremely rare in this period and were non-Christian individuals. The labor services performed by those who worked included farming, domestic labor in the house of the Lord. The serfs worked inside the Lord's home, taking care of the Lord and his family. They provided cleaning services. They provided laundry services. They were the repairmen, and also the women acted as nannies and wet nurses for the noble children. It was also their responsibility to do anything else in the Lord's house that was required of them. They also opened shops inside the Lord's land, doing things like making hardware, clothing, pottery. They were the blacksmiths, the bakers, the brewers, and brewing ale was an extremely profitable and lucrative job to have. Serfs often had a great deal of money, actually, by making beer, which was the favored drink of this time. They used their profits from making beer to build two-story homes. A serf could save up to buy his freedom, but usually, even when the freedom was bought, still remained on the noble's land, working in that village, but just as a free individual. The serfs were the artisans and craftsmen of the period. They also were required, as part of their service, to pay various fees and taxes, including paying rent on the land that was given to them for their own use. Each lord would divide his land into an area that was for his own use as well as for the use of the peasants. So each peasant or serf family would be given a tiny plot that was for his or her own use, and that plot was taxed by the lord. They also had to pay a fee if they had a cow or some other animal that required pasture lands, like a horse. They would have to pay the Lord to use his pasture lands. They were also required to pay a hunting fee. All the wildlife living on the village and around the Lord's house was considered to be his property. So if you hunted a rabbit or a deer or a squirrel, you could try to get away with not paying for it, but it was more likely that someone would snitch and tell on you, and you'd end up having to pay a fee for having hunted on the Lord's property. They also had to contribute to the dowry for the Lord's daughter, and when a serf inherited a home or anything else from a relative, they had to pay an inheritance fee as well. Serfs could obtain their freedom by running away and living in another village or town and remaining uncaught for 366 days. Sometimes, however, a serf would be granted manumission or freed by the Lord for having worked hard. Or a serf could buy his freedom by saving up money for himself and his family and then using a third-party individual to offer payment to the Lord. The manor on which the serfs lived was the basic unit of medieval organization, and it was the center of life. That is to say, the house in which the lord lived was called a manor or a castle or a village. So the actual house would be surrounded by all of the homes of the serfs and the businesses of the serfs and form a village. This was the center of rural life, the basic organization of rural life. And it depended on the amount of wealth that the lord had acquired as to how big the village and manor would be. It could be a few hundred acres or several 100,000 acres, depending on how rich the lord was. The lord divided his land into what was called the domain, which was his own area retained for his own family's use. Of course, he and his family didn't work that land. The serfs did, but this land was considered to be the land of the lord. The rest of his land he would subdivide among his serfs, who were then required to pay homage, that is, to work his land and perform any other services that were required. The domain was divided into 2 or 3 subfields. One field was always kept fallow since it needed to recuperate from harsh crops. Some crops like cotton and wheat have a devastating effect on the soil and will strip it of its nutrients. So they had to allow one field to remain fallow at all times so it could recover. Planting on the same soil year after year after year without the benefit of commercial fertilizers in this period would have meant less and less agricultural yield. In order to farm in this period, the serfs used some very basic tools like an axe, a plow, rake, pitchfork, and a horse collar. They also used as fertilizer chicken manure and compost. Cow manure was very hard to gather because cows were allowed to roam freely, so chicken was actually the preferred manure of the time. Life in the village is usually described as provincial and dull. People farmed, worked, drank, and went to church, never venturing more than 25 miles from the village. There was not a lot for social activity in these villages. The church was the social center of the village. The typical serf family was made up of a father, mother, and a few children. The responsibilities of the father included working his own plot of land alongside his wife and children, working on the Lord's land and in the Lord's house, however the Lord specified, as well as owning his own business in the village. The mother's responsibility was to work alongside her husband wherever he was required to work and to take care of her children. Children had very little what we would call childhood. They were left basically to have a childhood only until they were 7 years old. And around the age of 7, then children were put to work in the fields of the Lord and also gathering eggs, collecting firewood, etc., etc. So childhood was very short for the serf families. Life expectancy was also very short. Most serfs were dead by the age of 40. This was largely due to a lack of real, true health care and a very limited diet. Religion was extremely important to these serf families. Their life literally began and ended in church. Shortly after a serf child was born, it was taken to the church where it was baptized. It's one of the sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church's baptism. The child would then grow up in church, making friends, courting and dating inside the church. Marriage would occur in the church. That recently married couple would then bring their children when they started to have children there for a baptism, etc., etc., and the pattern continued to death, where the serf would be brought inside the church for a funeral ceremony and then buried in the churchyard. So the church was the center of their life, and the only real break that serfs got from their workday was what they called holy days. Those two words have since been brought together, and we know that phrase today as holidays. Holidays or holy days in this period included Christmas, Easter, Valentine's Day, and Halloween. Most serfs believed that sin occurred most likely in the dark and at night, so serfs had a tendency to be very fearful of going out at night, and they believed that the devil was ever present and would tempt a person to sin. Last thing I want to tell you about the serfs before moving on is that they practiced child abandonment. Typically, in the village next to the church would be a monastery or convent, or not too far from the church would be a monastery or a convent. The way most individuals became monks or nuns in this period is that their parents made that choice for them. A serf family, and even some noble families, when they had too many children and could not afford to care for them anymore, they would have 2 or 3 already, and another child came along, they would simply abandon it at the church or at the monastery or convent, and those children are what we call child oblates. They were offerings were given to the church by their parents. Those children were educated and brought up as monks or nuns. Why was child abandonment so common? Because in this period, people did not practice birth control. The teachings of the church at this time frowned upon birth control. The church believed, as did Christians in this period, that sex should be for procreation only, not as a recreational activity. So birth control was considered to be unnecessary. So if you ended up in a situation where you had more children than you could afford, rather than practicing birth control, you simply abandoned those children. To us, the logic is just faulty. The next group that we're going to look at are those who fight, the nobles and the knights. The nobility were an elite, that means small, self-conscious class, aware of their special privileges, who were specially privileged and had a great deal of power and influence, even though they were the minority in society. The responsibility of those who fight, namely, was to act as the legal system and law and order for the medieval period. Knights were professional soldiers among the nobility, and their function and role in society was to provide law and order. They were supposed to protect the weak, the church, the defenseless, to coin money or make money, make laws, enforce the laws, oversee trials, and dispense justice. But sometimes this power went to their head and they became very violent and would often terrorize the serfs that lived in the village. So in order to help transform the behavior of these knights, the church came up with what was called chivalry, and it was a code of behavior that was devised to transform the behavior of these crude and brutal and ill-mannered knights into loyal, brave, kind, honest, merciful men who were always very gentle in their treatment of the weak, the defenseless, and of society. Among the nobles, infant mortality, that is the number of children who died before their first birthday, was extremely high, and this was because largely noble women had no real access to medical care, just like serf women. But what made it worse was that some of the practices used by midwives in this period with noble births actually contributed to death of those infants. One of the ways that birth was supposedly sped up by midwives attending to noble women is what was called jostling, and essentially what they would do is they would shake a woman up and down, lifting her up and down, shaking her, jostling her around to get the baby to fall out. This often caused a great deal of internal damage for a woman, but also led to sometimes deformities for children as well as brain damage. So when nobles were unable to provide for extra children that they had, they abandoned them at the church as well. Primogeniture is important to note. Primogeniture was practiced among those who fight, and it is the tradition of willing an entire estate to a firstborn son. So if a noble family, whether it's a great lord, lesser lord, or simple knight, had 4 or 5 sons, by law and tradition, the only son who could inherit the property or estate was the firstborn son. Therefore, a second, third, fourth, or fifth son was seen as just sort of an extra child. These extra children had to find something to do, and normally they were sent away to a monastery to be educated, and also sometimes left there to become monks. These noble boys and girls had very little education as we think of it. Education for boys started around the age of 7 and concluded at the age of 21 with the ceremony of knighthood. So basically, a noble boy's education was to train him as a knight by serving other knights. Girls, on the other hand, were trained by their mothers or friends of their mothers. Sometimes these young noble boys and young noble girls would be sent away from their own manor, their own village, to work as knights in training or ladies in waiting in another home. So they would learn what their future roles would be by practicing for those roles either at home or at another village, at another manor. Girls were taught how to more or less manage a household, how to care for children, and sometimes a little bookkeeping or accounting training was involved. Young men among the noble class were not allowed to marry until their father died. So it is important for you to note that while young men were knights at the age of 21, they were not considered men officially until their fathers died and they inherited the estate of the father. Then this man, this youth, could marry, be considered a man, and start his own life. That means that some of these nobles were not considered men until they were in their late 20s, 30s, and sometimes as late as 40s before their father died. So with such a prolonged youth, with nothing to do but wait until their father's death, what did they do? Well, they got in trouble. That was the need for the code of chivalry. Many of these knights who were bored had nothing to do. Luckily, jousting and tournaments came along, as well as the Crusades, which gave these young men something to do. Young men who were waiting to marry and start their lives participated in jousts and tournaments. The difference between a joust and tournament is a simple one. A joust is 2 knights fighting each other. A tournament is teams of knights fighting against each other. And essentially the purpose of a joust or a tournament was to provide practice training for the battlefield, for the Crusades. So in a joust or tournament, the object is not to kill the opposing knight or knights. It's simply to unseat that knight from his horse. In battle, of course, you want to unseat the knight by killing him. So jousting and tournaments provided practice for these young knights in training, and it also gave them an opportunity to build a reputation as a fighter, because people from the village would come out and they would watch these jousts and tournaments underway. Also, it allowed them to take the equipment and horses of the losing knight or knights, so you could build even more of a future for yourself, but it was also more or less just an opportunity to keep them busy. When a knight's father finally died and he became officially a man, he was usually in his 30s or 40s. He did not, of course, choose a 30-something or 40-something-year-old woman. The marriage practices among the nobility at this time had older men marrying much younger girls. Usually the brides were 15 or 16 years old. And as we said in our lecture about the Crusades, this led to some sexual tension. These young girls were not especially happy with their husbands. They regarded their husbands as fatherly figures. They were not attracted to these older men. They were attracted to young boys who were about the same age as them. So when husbands went off to participate in a joust or tournament or crusades, these young women who were left in charge of the manor often engaged in adulterous affairs at court. In other words, these young men who are in training as knights, who are hanging around the castle, the manor house, provided these young women an opportunity to have sexual relations with someone who was much closer in age. So the next group that we'll briefly mention here are those who pray. Those who pray, of course, could be found in monasteries, convents, or nunneries. Those who pray included mainly monks and nuns, but we can also put in this category priests, bishops, archbishops, and popes. The jobs, functions, and social services performed by monks and nuns, the job, functions, social services performed by monks and nuns included, number one, prayer. Monks and nuns were expected to pray for the good of society at least 5 to 7 times per day. They also managed and ran and farmed their own land surrounding the monastery or convent. They also bred horses for the use of those who fight. They also made wine, which was very lucrative. So those who work make beer, those who pray make wine, those who fight buy the wine and the beer. Also, we should point out that they ran schools. If a person was educated in the Middle Ages, he was educated by a monk or she was educated by a nun. They also opened the monasteries and convents as hotels for travelers in Europe. They also provided what little medical care was available in this time period. So when someone sent for medical professionals or needed to go into the hospital, they sent for monks and nuns from the local monastery or convent or went there to receive treatment. It is also those who pray, monks and nuns, who are responsible for writing books at the time, and this is something you may not have thought of. Books at this time were all handwritten. There is no such thing as a printing press yet. So all of the books in Europe were large, handwritten books. So they were extremely expensive and very rare, but this was one of the important jobs of monks and nuns, is to make multiple copies of books. Also, let me just briefly mention that materialism was a problem for many monasteries and convents. Even though these monasteries and convents were supposed to be impoverished, not interested in the acquisition of material possessions, they were often guilty of trying to make their lives in these monasteries and convents as high class as possible. They wore the finest robes. They had books, Bibles that were inlaid with sapphires and rubies in the cover, gold leaf on the pages. They had remarkable diets, importing all kinds of delicacies, drinking wine. They spent a lot of money, sometimes more than they actually brought in, as hotels and makers of wine and breeders of horses, so that they ended up with debt. Debt and corruption became a major problem in the monasteries and convents of this time because they spent more money than they were bringing in, and rather than cutting back on expenditures, they would borrow money from the local nobles, which then pledged them to be loyal to the nobles in that village, which then led to a great deal of corruption. And that ends our look at chapter 10.